Today, I want to challenge the way we think about ethics, philosophy, and how we interact with the complexities of the world. We live in a time where relativism, a belief that everything is dependent on individual perspectives, has become a widely accepted explanation for ethical differences, cultural clashes, and personal values. It's a view that acknowledges complexity, but does so by distilling it down to a matter of perspective, leaving us with little more than subjective interpretations of right and wrong. But what if I told you that this approach, while intuitive, leaves something important behind? What if I told you that instead of relativism, there's a deeper, more holistic way of understanding the world and our place in it? A way that doesn't force us to choose between oversimplified right and wrong answers, but instead allows us to engage with the true interconnectedness of reality. I want to introduce you to a concept I call contextualism. This is a rediscovery of an ancient wisdom that is inherently triadic, meaning it looks at systems not in isolation, but as interdependent parts of a greater whole. This isn't just an alternative to relativism, but a framework for thinking, acting, and evaluating ethical complexities in a way that leads us to deeper understanding. To start, let's look at the undeniable appeal of relativism. In many ways, the people who subscribe to relativism have understood something important. They recognize that the world is too complex to fit into binary categories like right versus wrong, good versus evil. They see the shades of gray that exist between those extremes. But here's where things get tricky. Relativism offers a solution that ultimately avoids the problem. It acknowledges complexity, but doesn't know what to do with it. So it offers us this: it's all just a matter of perspective. Sounds liberating, doesn't it? On the surface, it seems like relativism respects the vast diversity of thought, culture, and experience. But it comes with a hidden cost. By reducing everything to individual perspectives, it implies that no perspective can ever truly engage with another. The observer is always separate from what's observed. Your truth is your truth. My truth is mine. And as a result, we lose the ability to connect with the deeper dynamics that shape reality. In this way, relativism introduces a kind of separation. It allows us to recognize the complexity of the world, but it doesn't give us any way to interact with or understand that complexity in a meaningful way. Everything becomes relative, and because of that, everything loses its meaning. The observer is left outside the system, unconnected and ungrounded. But here's the good news. This isn't the only way to engage with complexity. In fact, if we look at systems through the lens of contextualism, we see that the observer is never truly separate from the system. Instead, the observer is always participating in the dynamics of what's being observed, always influencing and being influenced. This is what I mean by contextuality. In a contextual model, every element, every action, every observation is part of a larger system of interrelated influences. It's triadic in nature. There's no such thing as a detached observer. Everything is in context, and that context shapes outcomes in real, tangible ways. Let me give you an example. In science, there's a phenomenon known as the observer effect. It shows up in quantum physics, where the very act of observing a particle can influence its behavior. But here's what's often overlooked. This isn't just a quirky rule of subatomic particles. The observer effect applies to everything. The moment you're part of a system, whether it's a conversation, a community, or a global economy, you're influencing that system, and it's influencing you in return. In contextualism, we embrace that influence, and we recognize that by understanding the relationships between these elements, we can predict, evaluate, and even change outcomes. This is the path to true understanding, not by standing outside the system as a detached observer, but by engaging with the system and seeing ourselves as part of the dynamic. Now let's shift gears and look at ethics, which is where the difference between relativism and contextualism becomes even more pronounced. In relativistic ethics, morality becomes reduced to preference. One culture prefers one thing, another prefers something else, and who are we to judge? But this approach leaves us adrift. It leaves us with no framework to assess the consequences of actions, no way to say definitively what might be harmful or beneficial in a given context. Contextualism, on the other hand, gives us a way forward. By seeing ethical choices as part of a system, we can evaluate affirmed and negated states. In simple terms, we can look at the effects of actions, whether they affirm or enhance the functioning of the system, or whether they negate or diminish it. We can see clearly how our choices influence not just ourselves, but the entire network of relationships around us. Evil, in this model, is no longer just a matter of personal or cultural judgment. It becomes something concrete, something that can be evaluated as a negated state within a system. Evil is what disrupts or destroys the harmony of the system. Good is what affirms and sustains it. This triadic model of ethics isn't just about subjective preferences, it's about real, observable influences. It allows us to engage with ethical complexity in a way that's grounded, meaningful, and actionable. As we move from the abstract ideas of relativity and contextuality into practical examples, we find that ancient wisdom already offers profound insights into the very dilemmas we've been discussing. One of the clearest expressions of this can be found in Zen Buddhism through Kōans. These are short, paradoxical stories or riddles designed to challenge conventional thought and deepen understanding. At first glance, Kōans seem to present us with irreconcilable contradictions, as though their purpose is to confuse the mind and lead us into non-linear leaps of enlightenment. The traditional explanation is that Kōans deliberately unsettle the intellect, pushing us towards some transcendent or mystical realization that cannot be grasped through ordinary logic. This interpretation is often accepted at face value, with the contradiction at the heart of the koan treated as an unsolvable mystery. But I want to suggest something different. I believe that koans are not inviting us to leap into illogical thinking, nor are they celebrating paradox for its own sake. Instead, koans are an ancient tool for teaching triadic reasoning, a framework where the resolution of contradictions is found in a third element that transcends and includes both opposing forces. Far from promoting a mystical escape from reason, koans offer us a method for reconciling the seemingly irreconcilable by understanding the interaction between the observer, the observed, and the context. This is crucial because our current struggle with relativism often leaves us trapped between binary extremes. As we've discussed, relativism acknowledges complexity, but ultimately offers only the escape route of perspective, reducing every insight or action to mere personal or cultural preference. Koans, however, show us a path beyond this relativistic dead end. They reveal that when faced with contradiction or paradox, we can integrate the tension into a higher understanding, one that doesn't merely retreat into subjective interpretation, but instead deepens our engagement with the system as a whole. Let's explore this concept further by looking at some famous koans interpreted through the lens of triadic thinking. This approach not only clarifies the wisdom of the koans themselves, but also provides practical lessons for improving our ethical understanding. One of the most well-known koans asks, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Traditionally, this is seen as a paradox meant to frustrate the student's expectations. How can one hand clap? Doesn't clapping require two hands? The question seems designed to defy logic, pushing the student towards some mystical realization beyond rational thought. But in the framework of triadic reasoning, the answer is not found in some transcendence of logic, but in the recognition of a third element that resolves the apparent contradiction. The two elements at play are sound and one hand. On the surface, these don't align. Sound, in this context, is usually associated with two hands clapping, and one hand alone seems incapable of producing the desired effect. But the koan invites us to look deeper. The third factor in this triad is the internal awareness of the observer. The sound of one hand clapping isn't external at all. It's internal. It's the sound of awareness itself, the recognition of the present moment. The koan leads us to a realization that sound can also be an internal mental phenomenon, a movement of perception, not of physical hands. In this way, the tension between one hand and sound is resolved by shifting our attention to the nature of awareness itself. This mirrors our earlier discussion of contextuality. The observer isn't detached from the system of sound. Their awareness creates the experience. Just as in ethical contexts, we must recognize the role we play in shaping outcomes. The Koan teaches us that understanding emerges when we shift from passive observation to active engagement with the system. Another famous koan involves a monk asking the master Jiaozhou, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" The master replies, "Mu," which means no, but more specifically negates the question's premise. At first, this seems like another paradox. After all, in Buddhist teachings, all beings are said to possess Buddha nature, so how can the answer be no? The traditional interpretation suggests that the master's answer is meant to shock the monk out of binary thinking, yes or no, has or hasn't, pushing him toward enlightenment. But through the lens of triadic reasoning, this koan becomes a lesson in how to transcend duality by introducing a third element, the recognition that the question itself is based on a misunderstanding. The monk assumes a binary choice. Either the dog has Buddha nature or it doesn't. But Jiaozhou's answer negates this limited frame of reference. He points the monk toward a contextual understanding of Buddha nature, where it's not a property one has or doesn't have, but rather a state of realization that transcends such categories. Here again, we find a practical ethical lesson: context matters. In any ethical system, we can't simply ask, is this right or wrong, as if morality is a static property of actions or individuals. Instead, we must ask how actions and beings interact with the broader system. Is this action affirming or negating the health of the system? Is it contributing to or detracting from the flourishing of life? The triadic framework allows us to evaluate not based on fixed rules, but based on contextual effects. In another well-known koan, two monks argue about a flag. One says, "The flag is moving." The other says, "No, the wind is moving." Then the Zen master Huineng interrupts, saying, "It is not the wind that moves, it is not the flag that moves. It is your mind that moves." This koan presents a binary opposition flag versus wind. The two monks are stuck in a debate over which object is moving, each clinging to a limited perspective. But Huineng's insight introduces the third element, the mind of the observer. The movement is not in the flag or the wind, but in consciousness itself. It's the mind's perception of movement that creates the experience of motion. From a triadic perspective, this koan offers a profound ethical insight. Our perceptions, judgments, and ethical choices are not external to the system we're observing. Just as the mind perceives movement in the world, our ethical frameworks are shaped by the interplay between our internal states and the external context. What we perceive as right or wrong depends on our engagement with the system. And that engagement is never neutral. We are part of the system, not separate from it. So, what can we take away from this reinterpretation of koans? First, it becomes clear that contradictions are not problems to be avoided. They are essential tools for pushing us toward deeper understanding. The contradictions in a koan aren't meant to frustrate us into abandoning logic. They're meant to show us that the apparent opposition between two ideas can be resolved by introducing a third factor. Second, this triadic framework provides a more robust approach to ethical reasoning. In a relativistic worldview, we might be tempted to say, well, it's all just a matter of perspective. But koans teach us that perspective is only part of the story. The context in which we observe, act, and relate to the world profoundly shapes what is right or wrong, good or harmful. When we engage with contradictions, not by abandoning them, but by seeking the third factor that resolves the tension, we move toward a more nuanced and actionable form of ethics. And this brings us back to the central theme of our talk, contextualism versus relativism. Where relativism leaves us stranded in a sea of subjective perspectives, contextualism offers us a map. By embracing triadic reasoning, we can navigate the complexities of life, not by forcing them into binary categories or dismissing them as unknowable, but by engaging with the system as a whole. Koans, in their essence, are lessons in this kind of thinking. They teach us that the observer is never detached, that the system is always interconnected, and that the apparent contradictions we face in life, whether in ethics, philosophy, or everyday decision-making, can be understood and resolved through a triadic framework. When we move beyond the binary, we begin to see the full context of our actions and relationships, allowing us to make ethical choices that affirm the well-being of the entire system. This is the wisdom that Kōans have to offer, and it's the wisdom that contextualism brings to our modern world. So what does all this mean? It means that we can't afford to remain stuck in the binary world of right and wrong, black and white. Nor can we retreat into the relativistic comfort of saying, well, it's all just perspective. We need something more. We need a framework that respects the complexity of the world, but also engages with it in a meaningful way. That framework is contextualism. By embracing contextual thinking, we move from separation to integration, from preference to real ethical evaluation. We move beyond relativism and into a deeper understanding of how our actions, observations, and relationships shape the world we live in. This isn't an escape from complexity. It's an invitation to engage with it fully, to rediscover the ancient wisdom of triadic philosophy, and to see ourselves as part of the system, not just observers.